In my founding role as the editor of the Posthumanity series at Minnesota, I get asked a lot about trends, as you might imagine. What's hot now? What's the next big thing? How do you see the future of theory? And so on and so forth. One of the things I say in response to such questions is that the question of the animal, so called, even as it certainly remains a growth industry in a number of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, as we can see right now from what we're doing at this conference, seems to have been left behind all too predictably by the economy of planned obsolescence in academic knowledge production and theory. As Nicholas Luhmann pointed out a long time ago, as in other social systems, the autopoiesis of the disciplines depends upon the ceaseless production of novelty. And in that context, the animal, quote unquote, needed to be replaced as quickly as possible by plants, and then plants by stones, and then stones by the object more generally. And finally, as part of the ceaseless desire in theoretical discourse over the past decade for the bedrock of the real, quote unquote, by more general materialism, sometimes styled as new materialism, and realism, sometimes spun as speculative realism, and so on. Against this more general background of the drive toward what we might call the inescapably real in theory, more recently, under the spur of rapid global warming, the discourse of the Anthropocene has become the site upon which all of these elements and these desires too are assembled and reassembled in various combinations, often in retooled attempts to be the latest version of what had been called during the heyday of object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, flat ontology. Of course, my version of posthumanism shares this desire to radically decenter the human in relation to the rest of the universe, disallowing any prima facie ontological divide between what calls itself man, to borrow Jacques Derrida's judicious phrasing, and everything else. But to put it slightly otherwise, as I argued in What is Posthumanism, when it comes to the decentering of the human, the issue isn't just what you're thinking, but how you're thinking it. And here, one might draw a bright line between so-called flat on what one might call jagged ontologies, ones that pay attention to differences and to how, as Bateson puts it, those differences make a difference, in this case, to thinking global warming and the discourse of the Anthropocene. In this context, I'll engage later Bruno Latour's Facing Gaia, which I hope you can see the cover of right now, with its admirable desire to assert what he calls the outlaw character of Gaia as a stay against both holism and humanism, and their understanding of Gaia as a kind of mythical superorganism. As we'll see, however, rendition has abandoned the question of the animal prematurely because what the site of the animal shows is that flat ontologies, and finally Latour's own actor network theory, evacuate the radical discontinuity between qualitatively different orders of causation that obtain in living versus physical systems, different orders that are fundamental to and impact differently the evolution of the biosphere and the planet, climate change, and ultimately the entire concept of Gaia. As we'll see later, with Latour's mobilization of actor network theory and Facing Gaia as my example, what looks anti-reductionist often isn't anti-reductionist at all, and this is far from a merely academic matter. Now, this is a good place to remind ourselves of Derrida's admonition in The Animal That Therefore I Am, of animal, what a word, as he puts it. His consternation, his incredulity, really, is based upon the fact that, quote, confined within this catch-all concept, within this vast encampment of the animal, is this in the general singular, within the strict enclosure of this definite article are all the living things that man does not recognize as his fellows, his neighbors, or his brothers. And that is so in spite of the infinite space that separates the lizard from the dog, the protozoan from the dolphin, the shark from the lamb, the parrot from the chimpanzee, the camel from the eagle, the squirrel from the tiger, the elephant from the cat, the ant from the silkworm, or the hedgehog from the echidna, unquote. Now, Derrida's list is just long enough to make you want him to stop, but that's partly his point. When it comes to non-human creatures, there is no stopping. In retrospect, Derrida's point seems utterly obvious. I mean, just look around yourself on the next beach trip you take, or even in your own backyard. Then one has to ask, how did we get here? How did human beings ever find it remotely plausible that the world is neatly riven by an ontological divide? Over here, on one side, Homo sapiens, and over there, on the other side, every other single form of non-human animal life. What a myopically audacious idea. Derrida, in fact, calls it asinine, fully intending the joke, of course. Excuse me. Derrida's point, however, is that it's not therefore simply a matter of throwing up our hands and saying we're all the same. It's not a matter of asserting a homogeneous continuity, as he puts it, between what calls itself man and what he calls the animal. This biologistic continuism, as he puts it, is just as asinine as the locution the animal. Rather, it's a matter of tending as diligently as possible to the amazing multiplicity and heterogeneity of all the ways of being on the earth that go under the name animal. It's not a matter of effacing or ignoring the immense differences between different forms of life and the worlds they inhabit and bring into being, but rather of tending in a philosophically and ethically responsible way to what he calls the heterogeneous multiplicity of the living. We find here not one line between human and animal, but many. And the task, as he puts it, is, quote, not in effacing the limit, but in multiplying its figures, in complicating, thickening, delinearizing, folding, and dividing the line precisely to make it increase and multiply, unquote. In the current context of the Anthropocene, global warming, and an intense interest in all things ecological and environmental, this task would seem to invite what one might call a more ecological approach to what an older philosophical vocabulary called the animal. After all, as a range of philosophers from Terence Deacon to Gilbert Simondon to Gilles Deleuze would remind us, there's not really, in ecological terms, anything called the animal, and there never has been. Individual animals and their species are simply temporary formal stabilizations and coherences, what complexity theorist Stuart Kauffman calls Kantian wholes, produced by a concatenation of environmental forces and materials that, strictly speaking, have nothing to do with either the animal or the human. These are merely two highly improbable forms of organized complexity that emerge from the interaction of what G. Evelyn Hutchinson called the ecological theater in the evolutionary play, a point I'll return to later. So with all of this in mind, let's return to the discourse of the Anthropocene. I have to admit, I'm a little bit tired of talking about it. One of my main reservations about the Anthropocene is voiced by Latour himself in Facing Gaia, where he suggests that the problem with the concept is not so much that it constitutes, quote, an immoderate extension of anthropocentrism, unquote, but rather, and here he's making the same point that Derrida made about the animal, its invocation of, quote, the human as a unified agent, a universal concept. More seriously still, the Anthropocene concept threatens to authorize, quote, a premature leap to a higher level by confusing the figures of connection with those of totality, unquote, which leads in turn to what he calls a deanimation of the agents and actants, most of them non-human, of course, that are caught up in what William James once called the pluriverse, where, quote, quoting Latour now, we have to agree to remain open to the dizzying otherness of existence, the list of which is not closed, and to the multiple ways they have of existing and relating amongst themselves, unquote. Now, Bruce Clark, in this book that I'm happy to say, like Dom's last book, is published book before last was published in the Posthumanity series, gives an even more pointed critique of the deanimation and totalization noted by Latour. As he notes, what started out as a disciplinary designation in the subfield of geology known as stratigraphy gets amplified over time in ways that belie the Anthropocene concept's supposed posthumanism. As Clark puts it, while, quote, in a modest way, the Anthropocene is certainly conceivable as a concept indicating the potential threshold for archaeological stratigraphy, in its actual deployment in the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program, the globalized administrative body charged with coordinating academic and governmental activity related to the phenomenon, what we get instead is what he calls, quote, a hunk of traditional geology with an overlay of living beings, but without closed systematicity, unquote. The paradoxical and autopoetic fact that the Earth is, quote, a system with a panoply of feedbacks interconnecting biotic and abiotic systems into metabiotic systems, unquote, in which the Earth itself is, quote, the system that arises as the sum effect of the operations of all these variegated subsystems, tends to be forgotten. So what we're left with is at one end, this thing called the planet, and at the other end, this thing called life that happens to live on it. What we end up with, he argues, is a detachment of geology from biology, which is bad science, quote, except insofar as human beings are to stand in for the whole of biology, unquote. So with all of that in mind, excuse me, with all of that in mind, I want to suggest in the remainder of this talk that what the Anthropocene needs from the animal is the non-reductive differentiation of biological from physical principles that are crucial to understanding the role of life in what Latour calls the new climatic regime of the Anthropocene. Here I'm going to provide a much shortened version of the material that I cover in the third chapter of my last book, Ecological Poetics, or Wallace Stevens Birds, focusing for the moment on the work of MacArthur Fellow and Santa Fe Institute co-founder Stuart Kauffman. Central to my argument is Kauffman's claim in his book, Humanity in a Creative Universe from 2017, that there are no entailing laws that predetermine the evolution of the biosphere, hence the creative universe of the book's title. In the section of Kauffman's book that I'm most interested in, he assumes almost exclusively classical chemistry and physics, and quote, the point is not to show that Newton's laws do not often work, they do, but to begin to demolish the hegemony of reductive materialism and its grip on our scientific minds, unquote. The central thrust of this section of the book, which forces us to rethink not just the evolution of the biosphere, but also the entire concept of ecology, is that, quote, at least part of why the universe has become complex is due to an easy to understand, but not well recognized anti-entropic process that does not vitiate the second law of thermodynamics. Briefly, he continues, and I'm quoting Kauffman now, briefly, as more complex things and linked processes are created and can combine with one another in ever more new ways to make yet more complex amalgams of things and processes, the space of possible things and linked processes becomes vastly larger, and the universe has not had time to make all the possibilities. There's an indefinitely expanding, ever more open space of possibilities, ever more sparsely sampled, as the complexity of things and linked processes increases. There's a deep sense in which the universe becomes complex in its exploration of these ever more sparsely sampled spaces of what is possible because it can, unquote. One of the more compelling examples he gives of this principle obtains at the level of organic chemistry before we even get to the domain of autopoetic organisms, or what he calls Kantian wholes, where we would more likely expect to find such forms of complexity. In a key passage in the book, he writes, quote, proteins are linear strings of amino acids bound together by peptide bonds. There are 20 types of amino acids in evolved biology. A typical protein is perhaps 300 amino acids long, and some are several thousand amino acids long. Now he continues, how many possible proteins are there with 200 amino acids? Well, there are 20 choices for each of the 200 positions. So 20 to the 200th or 10 to the 260th possible proteins with the length of 200 amino acids. This is a tiny subset of the molecular species of chnops, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, with 100,000 atoms per molecule. Now, the universe is 13.7 billion years old and has about 10 to the 80th particles. The fastest time scale in the universe is the Planck time scale of 10 to the negative 49 seconds. If the universe were doing nothing but using all 10 to the 80th particles in parallel to make proteins the length of 200 amino acids, each in a single Planck moment, it would take 10 to the 39th repetitions of the history of the universe to make all of the possible proteins the length of 200 amino acids just once. As we consider proteins the length of 200 amino acids and all possible chnops molecules with 100,000 atoms or less per molecule, it's obvious that the universe will never make them all. History enters when the space of what is possible is vastly larger than what can actually happen. The next point is simple and clear. Consider all the chnops molecules that can be made with 1, with 2, with 3, with 4, with n, with 100,000 atoms per molecule. Call the space of possible molecules with n atoms of chnops the phase space for chnops molecules of n atoms. That phase space increases enormously as n increases. Consequently, in the lifetime of the universe, as n increases, that phase space will be sampled ever more sparsely, unquote. And I have to say, I have not checked the math on this, but I asked Stu about it. He's a MacArthur fellow. He says the math is right, so I'm taking his word for it. If there are any objections, you can take it up with him. Okay, moving on. As Kaufman shows, this non-ergodic principle obtains even more radically and obviously at the level of the biosphere, in which, quote, its becoming cannot be prestated, is not governed by entailing laws, in which what becomes constitutes ever new actuals that are enabling constraints that do not cause but enable ever new, typically unprestatable adjacent possible opportunities into which the evolving biosphere becomes, unquote. And when we reach the level of what he calls Kantian wholes or autopoietic organisms, this process is, not surprisingly, even more striking. If we think about the concept of biological function, for example, it's clear that while, quote, in classical physics there are only happenings, the ball rolls down the hill, bumps into a rock and veers and so on, in biology we have to distinguish function from mere physical happening. Quote, the function of the heart is to pump blood, he notes, but the heart, quote, causally also makes heart sounds, jiggles water in the pericardial sac, and so on. Classical physics will not help us here because, quote, the function of the part is its causal consequences that help sustain the whole. Function is causal, in other words, but causal in a qualitatively different way from classical physics. As Kaufman notes, another nail in the coffin for the reductionist approach is the fact that, quote, this capacity to define a function as a subset of causal consequences that can be improved in evolution further separates biology from physics, which cannot make the distinction among all the causal consequences into a subset, which are functions, unquote. Paying attention to these qualitatively different orders of causation in physical versus biological systems is absolutely crucial to understanding what are sometimes called the mereological relations, whole to part or part to whole, in living systems, where the relationship between the part and the whole is radically different from what we find in physical systems. We typically think of causation in the scientific domain as bottom up, as we do in the central dogma of neo-Darwinism, where the lines of causality run from the gene to physical characteristics, biomorphology, and so on of the organism. But in the dynamic, self-organizing autopoietic forms of life in the biosphere, we find a much more complex relationship between the component or the element in the system, because causality often operates in top-down and distributed fashion as well. As Alicia Warrero notes, these mereological relationships, quote, have bedeviled philosophers of science for centuries. But what we now see is that the unpleasant whiff of paradox that remains in any mention of recursive causality, as she puts it, in living systems is absolutely unavoidable and indeed a crucial part of understanding living systems. What we find in autopoietic biological systems, in fact, is what she calls, quote, a decoupling in the locus of control. The components' behaviors suddenly originate in and are under the control, regulation, and modulation of the emergent properties of the macro level as such, unquote, which in turn, quote, loosens the one-to-one strict determinism from the micro to the macro level, unquote. In contrast to physical systems, even those that show emergent self-organization, like dust devils, tornadoes, Bernard cells, and so on, where, quote, external agents or circumstances are responsible for the conditions within which self-organization takes place, the pot that constrains boiling water, for example. In autopoietic systems, those conditions and constraints are introduced and maintained by the system itself, resulting in a strong downward causation in which systemic closure becomes, quote, a closure of constraint production, not just a closure of processes, unquote. This means, as she notes, quoting Kaufman, that, quote, it's impossible to predict emergent properties, even in principle, because the categories necessary to frame them do not exist until after the fact, unquote. And of course, if everything we have said of biological organisms is true of us, it is in fact all the more the case with us, and for the reasons that Warrero notes. The more complex the autopoietic life form, the more we find a dynamic decoupling of the causative relationship between the micro and the macro levels. Or as she puts it, system and environment co-evolve over time in such a way that the identification between macro property and specific configuration becomes irrelevant. As we go up the evolutionary ladder, the go of things issues more and more from higher and higher levels and according to criteria established at progressively emergent levels. Just as living things are autonomous and self-directed in a way that physical dissipative structures are not, sentient, conscious, and self-conscious being are even more autonomous and self-directed, unquote. But here, I think, precisely at this juncture, we need a stringent dose of deconstruction. Specifically, Derrida's critique of what he calls the auto, of autonomy, auto-affection, autobiography, and so on. In short, his critique of intentionality and of related concepts such as agency, in which Latour, of course, traffics quite freely. It's not that autonomy and self-directedness don't increase, as Warrero suggests, with the increasing decoupling of micro and macro structures and the growing importance of downward causality. They do. It's just that the picture that intentionality and autonomy gives to itself, as Derrida characterizes it, of its own situation is unavoidably partial, reductive, and blind to the full infrastructural conditions of possibility for its emergence, or what we've already called its ecological embeddedness. Excuse me. Now, when we move from the level of the organism to the level of the biosphere, we find the same recursive logic at work on a different scale. Having established the importance of the concept of biological function, Kaufman hypothesizes that we cannot prestate the evolution of new functions in the biosphere, hence cannot prestate the ever-changing phase space of biological evolution, which includes precisely the functions of organisms and their myriad parts and processes evolving in their worlds. But these ever-new functions, he continues, constitute the ever-changing phase space of biological evolution. And what this means, logically enough, is that we can have no entailing laws at all for biological evolution, unquote. He offers a nice compact example of this process in his discussion of what are called Darwinian pre-adaptations or exaptations, the emergence of new, possibly useful traits through random genetic mutation, just to stay with the discourse of the neo-Darwinian orthodoxy for a moment more. Kaufman's especially winning example of this process, where a side effect generated by random genetic mutation can become a functional asset for an organism under different environmental conditions, as Darwin himself surmised, is the emergence of the swim bladder in fish. The Darwinian exaptation, whereby some early versions of fish had lungs, enabling them to bounce from puddle to puddle, led in time to the biological function of a ratio of air and water in fish who now live wholly in water, which allows in turn neutral buoyancy in the water column. Did this change the future evolution of the biosphere, Kaufman asked? Quote, yes, and in two vastly different ways. First, new daughter species of fish with swim bladders and new proteins evolved. But second, once the swim bladder exists, it constitutes a new actual condition in the evolving biosphere. The swim bladder now constitutes a new, empty, but adjacent possible niche or opportunity for evolution. For example, a species of worm or bacteria could evolve to live, say, exclusively in the swim bladder. The adjacent possible opportunities for evolution given the new swim bladder do not include all possibilities. For example, a T-Rex or a giraffe could not evolve to live in the swim bladder, unquote. One of the key theoretical points here arises when Kaufman asks, quote, do we think that selection in any way acted to achieve the swim bladder as constituting a new adjacent possible empty niche into which a worm or a bacterial species might evolve to live? No. Further, he adds, does the swim bladder, once it has come to exist, cause the worm or bacterial species to evolve to live in it? No. The swim bladder enables, but does not cause, the bacterial or worm species to evolve to live in it. Instead, quantum random mutations to the DNA of the bacterium or the worm yield variations in screwdrivers that may be selected at the level of the whole organism, by which the worm or bacterial species evolves to live in the swim bladder, unquote. More radically still, this means that, quote, there is therefore no non-circular way to define the niche of the organism separately from the organism itself. But that niche is the boundary condition on selection. The niche is only revealed after the fact by what succeeds in evolution, unquote. Okay, moving to the next phase of the paper, we're now, I think, in a better position to specify exactly what's wrong with Latour's actor network theory ontology in Facing Gaia, and to specify, moreover, why those problems are tethered to an insufficient understanding of the difference between first order and second order systems theory, and how those in turn bear upon our understanding of the mereological relations of organisms and the qualitatively different orders of causality in biological versus physical systems. A crucial underlying problem, I think, is that Latour continues to understand the term system and autopoiesis as if they were simply synonyms for homeostasis and command and control. And the fingerprints of this misunderstanding are all over his use of the term cybernetics in Facing Gaia. When Latour writes that the figure of the loop is, quote, the only way to draw a path between agents without resorting to the notions of part and a whole, that only the presence of an all-powerful engineer, providence, evolution, or a thermostat could have set up, unquote, he immediately cautions us to, quote, not to hurry to identify this movement with feedback loops in the cybernetic sense. We would revert at once to the model of a rudder, a helmsman, or a world government, unquote. But what he doesn't understand here, and what he doesn't understand when he suggests that Gaia is the outlaw, the anti-system, as he puts it, is a fundamental point that I explore in great detail, excruciating maybe, in What is Posthumanism? The second order systems theory of the sort mobilized by Maturana and Varela, Warrero, Kaufman, and others is best understood, as Dirk Becker puts it, as, quote, an attempt to do away with any usual notion of system, the theory in a way being the deconstruction of its central term. unquote. Latour is right, of course, in his discussion of Lovelock that, quote, all the sciences, natural or social, are haunted by the specter of the organism. But he's wrong when he says that that figure, quote, always becomes more or less surreptitiously a superorganism. That is, a dispatcher to whom the task, or rather the holy mystery, as he puts it, of successfully coordinating the various parts is attributed. He continues, as soon as you imagine parts that fulfill a function within a whole, you're inevitably bound to imagine also an engineer who proceeds to make them work together, unquote. But as we've already seen with Kaufman's discussion of the concept of biological function in the larger context of the evolution of the biosphere with no entailing laws, this is an unwarranted assimilation of the concept of the organismic closure in what Kaufman calls Kantian wholes to a first order notion of holism and homeostasis. This in turn authorizes for Latour an engineering command and control understanding of causality and systems theory as centric rather than decentered and decoupled, as Warrero notes, whereas the whole point of Kaufman's non-ergodic, unentailed evolution of the biosphere is that it makes such an engineering fantasy literally unthinkable. So it should come as no surprise that Latour cannot understand that in second-order systems theory, the account of the relationship between the part and the whole, those mereological relationships that we saw Warrero discussing a moment ago, is actually the opposite of the picture that he offers here. We find the same sort of elision in Latour's rendering of the inside and the outside of the organism-environment relationship, where he simply collapses the inside of autopoetic distinction in second-order systems theory into what he calls the selfish position and the economy of optimization in neo-Darwinian theory that's associated with Richard Dawkins and his selfish gene theory. On the one hand, he seems to understand the second order systems theory rendering of the organism environment relationship when he writes that, quote, properly speaking, for Lovelock and even more clearly for Len Margulis, there is no longer any environment to which one might adapt. Since all living agents follow their own intentions all along, modifying their neighbors as much as possible, there's no way to distinguish between an environment to which the organism is adapting and the point at which its own action begins, unquote. Okay, so far so good. But the theoretical coherence of Latour's discussion goes completely off the rails when he glosses the following passage by one of Lovelock's collaborators, Timothy Linton, who writes that, quote, in Gaia, quote, the evolution of organisms and the material environment are so closely coupled that they form a single indivisible process. Organisms possess environment-altering traits because the benefit that these traits confer to the fitness of the organisms outweighs the cost in energy to the individual, unquote. Now, Latour gleefully reads, or rather misreads this passage as saying that, quote, the inside and outside of all borders are subverted, not because everything is connected in a great chain of being, not because there's some global plan that orders the concatenation of agents, but because the interaction between a neighbor who is actively manipulating his neighbors and all the others who are manipulating the first one defines what could be called waves of action, which respect no borders, and even more importantly, never respect any fixed scale, unquote. But the obvious and question-begging problem here, of course, is how one can speak of neighbors and their intentions, so important to the premium that Latour places on the productive play of agents, after all, when the inside and outside of all borders are subverted, unquote. So what Latour is unable to theorize here is the relationship, indeed what one could call the properly deconstructive relationship between inside and outside, neighbor and environment, because he doesn't grasp the key insight of second order systems theory and the theory of autopoiesis, that the contingency of the self-reference of autopoietic organisms is the wild card, the outlaw at the core of everything that Latour wants from the unpredictable agency and intentions, to use his language, that push back against reductive totalization and the engineering fantasies of life and nature that emerge from it. To be even more specific about this, the outlaw character of the biosphere, and therefore its impact on the larger Earth system of Gaia, is to be located not just in the contingency of the organism's self-reference and how it selectively determines its environment, its world, but also in the fact that that self-reference provides the condition of possibility for the recursive operations of biological organisms in real time, and how that recursivity can make environmental differences make a difference, to borrow Gregory Bateson's phrase once again, establishing the very decoupling and the locus of control and the downward causality that we saw Warrero parsing for us a moment ago. Now, what does this do? It enables, and this is my third point, what I call the second order turn toward, in what is posthumanism, what I call the second order turn of openness from closure that I explore in some detail on those pages. Closure and the recursive selectivity that goes with it, a selectivity forced upon organisms by the fact that any environment is always already exponentially more complex than any individual system, increases the differences that can make a difference in the organism's environment. In other words, to put it in shorthand, what separates us from the world is precisely what connects us to the world. So to slice this a little more finely, there are actually three wild cards in the deck here. There's the contingency of self-reference that we find in Kantian wholes or autopoietic organisms, in which the meaning of an element is conferred by its functional role in the whole organism. Second, there's recursivity, the circular processes by which that self-reference operates dynamically in real time in the production of what Warrero calls constraint closure, as not merely mechanical but processive, which enables differences in the environment to make a difference in the organism in the services of adaptation to a changing world. And third, there's how that recursivity structures the organism-environment relationship in an ongoing way, not just on the side of the organism, but also on the side of the environment, as we see dramatically illustrated in the phenomenon of niche construction, the so-called Baldwin effect, and many other examples. As Alexander Wilson notes in his remarkable new book in the Posthumanities series, Aesthesis and Perceptronium, in the kinds of evolutionary arms races that are dramatized in niche construction, we find highly selective feedback loops that recursively compound themselves and change the biosphere in the process of doing so. For example, he notes, a bat evolves echolocation, which allows it to locate moths, in turn provoking the moths to evolve a capacity to hear the bats and maneuver evasively, which in turn presses the bats to evolve better maneuverability, and so on. These runaway effects occur everywhere in nature. Arms races and niches necessarily close themselves off from the overarching environmental influences and take off, playing their own private games, and therefore drift along unpredictably. This leads to the proliferation of complexity and nonlinear relations between species and their environments. The niche reinforces the specialness of its particular character. There are local top-down selectors where the competition between individuals drives a progressively intensifying race to grow longer plumage or devise more complex songs and dances, and so on. In other words, when it comes to the biosphere and its role in the larger system of Gaia, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically, second order closure and the recursivity it enables between organism and environment is the joker in the deck, the most unpredictable source of the outlaw characteristics of alterity and contingency that Latour wants from Gaia to mobilize against the old term nature. Now, one might ask why that alterity can't simply be located at the level of what Latour calls connection and waves of action. Well, it is located there, of course, but the important point is that the kinds of connections that an entity is capable of having is heavily constrained, enabled but not determined, as Kaufman puts it, by the closure and self-reference of the entity in question, and how that affects the causative relations between the elements in the system, the locus of control, and the environment. And if we don't pay attention to these underlying conditions of possibility for connections, a need that really gets ratcheted up, as Warrero and Kaufman note, when we come to the level of multicellular organisms and Kantian wholes, then we threaten to fall back into the flattening of living versus physical systems and their radically different modes of causality and organization that includes their specific role in the larger dynamic of climate change and Gaia. So one of the things that the Anthropocene can learn from the animal then is that the alterity, creativity, and outlaw relations that obtain among what Latour calls actants are, for the reasons I've been outlining, much more unruly and unpredictable among biological life forms and their environmental relations than between, say, stones or vacuum cleaners. And here, of course, we can add yet another layer of recursivity that gets flattened in actor network theory, the not and the no, the domain of the negative, introduced by the goal-directed behavior of what Kaufman calls Kantian wholes. Again, Warrero, just as living things are autonomous and self-directed in a way that physical dissipative structures are not, sentient, conscious, and self-conscious being are even more autonomous and self-directed, unquote. Here, as Yuhui suggests, teleonomy, not teleology, is the term that we want. Goal-directed and purposive doesn't mean linear and pre-programmed, but quite the contrary, because, quoting him, recursivity is not only a mechanism that can effectively domesticate contingency, it's also a mechanism that allows novelty to occur, not simply as something coming from the outside, but also as an internal transformation, unquote. And this, of course, can and does feed back into the environment, as Wilson noted in that previous quotation. As theoretical biologist Dennis Noble observes of the Baldwin effect and so-called adaptability drivers in niche construction, when organisms create new niches in which to flourish, quote, the process is an active choice of organisms, including learned behavior. The causality involved here is very far from random, unquote. They change the environment that changes them in an increasingly overdetermined ways, as Wilson has already noted. So let me conclude then, last couple of pages. Let me conclude then by summing up some of the salient points. First, physics is not biology. Qualitatively different orders of causation and complexity obtain. It's not that biology can flout the so-called laws of physics, it's rather a simple necessary versus sufficient distinction. The particular modes of organization and causality that obtain in the biosphere cannot in any way be assimilated as an equal partner to a more general actor network theory, much less to any kind of flat ontology. Could we come up with an algorithm for the difference between these different partners? I believe, and I believe that Latour believes, that the answer is no. Second, what Latour means by outlaw, to use his term, is really, as far as I can tell, just contingency. But as we have seen, this needs to be parsed in a much, much finer way. There's the kind of contingency that we find in Kaufman's Chinops proteins example quoted earlier, which is essentially mathematical and combinatory, though already, as he notes, non-ergodic, so even here history enters, as he puts it. Then there's the recursivity that we find in Kantian wholes, in which the functional uptake of those combinatory possibilities by biological entities takes a second order turn, dynamically and in real time, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically, so that selection and closure become the drivers of complexity and creativity, as we saw in niche construction. Then there's the recursivity of the domain of the not and the negative in biological organisms that we see in the Baldwin effect and what we call proportionate learning and creative teleonomy among a wide range of organisms. In a meta-theoretical context, then, it's important, I think, to insist on these distinctions because of the importance at this precise moment of developing a robust interdisciplinary anti-reductionism, a side project of which, but a central strategic goal of which, involves, as far as I'm concerned, doing our part to bring to an end the hegemony of the neo-Darwinian paradigm. On this terrain, Latour and I are, of course, on the same team. Here, however, to reach back to my opening comments from What is Posthumanism about the importance of not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it, I would insist on the importance of working hard to theorize an anti-reductionist anti-reductionism. And here, I think Latour and I are not on the same team, at least not on the terrain that I've explored in this talk, even though we share the same theoretical and existential desire to push back against reductionism in all its forms. In that context, I would insist that the discourse and problematic of the animal is not done just yet, far from it, even though the current fashion is to see it as perhaps an early and already obsolete mode of posthumanist intervention. Paying serious attention to the animal can force the discourse of the Anthropocene to pay attention to something crucial and far more pervasive in a way that reaches far beyond the question of climate change. That what's needed here at the current moment is not flat, but ever more jagged ontologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cary, and we'll pass it off to Dominic for his response. Then, Cary, you'll have an opportunity to respond, and then we will open it up to the general Q&A after that.
Great. Okay, so thanks so much, first of all, to Aaron for the invitation. It's really great to be responding to Cary. And thanks to Cary for such a stimulating, rich, incredibly detailed, sophisticated talk. I sometimes think about, Cary's so in demand now with Zoom as well. I imagine your calendar, you have certain days with no keynote written on them, right? It's like, oh, next Thursday, I'm not giving a keynote. So yeah, you haven't learned anything about resting on your laurels or anything like that. And your restless mind is still producing cutting edge knowledge and not sitting still at all.
Dom, it's very easy to be restless during a pandemic.
We all have our ways of coping, for sure. Yeah. But what's interesting in the context of this conference, in a way, I wish we could freeze this talk and thaw it out again in maybe 10 years or 5 years, let's say, because in the local ecosystem, it's been a bit of an uphill struggle to even have folks recognize the figure of the animal as a legitimate sort of concept when we're talking about things like politics, sociology, etc. So, Alice has obviously been working uphill here, Hugh Raffles, Rafi Youet, and a few others. But it's happening, and so it's sort of a little disorienting to sort of ask what was the animal when we're still trying to introduce the animal into the room. But that's it's good for us to see the terrain that's already happened ahead. And it is great to see, obviously, the grad students in philosophy really taking some leads here. Obviously, my own thinking owes a lot to Cary, to Cary's work directly, and also indirectly in the series that he's curated. So yeah, I couldn't be more honored to be part of his contribution to the intellectual publication ecology of the world. That's a lot of the things he's critiquing, he's also released into the world in certain fashion. So apologies for some notes here because it's been a long year. But I must say I really do like and welcome the idea of jagged ontologies, and I found Cary's critique of Latour here, and by extension, entire subfields of the post-humanities, extremely suggestive and illuminating. So given how rich the material is, I did have a bit of trouble condensing down things to one crisp question, but I'll try not to indulge too much in the this is more a comment than a question genre, but I am the official respondee, so I can do that a little bit. But overall, I guess what given the sort of time lag I mentioned before, I'd be grateful if you could circle back a bit and pin the tail on the donkey in terms of your nuancing and parsing of, you have the recursive negentropic loops between environment, organism, and deep evolutionary time, and the title of your talk. So you kind of pull the animal, the rabbit as it were, out of the hat at the end of the talk. You show it to us at the beginning, and then you drop it into this inky void of second order systems dynamics, and then you pull it out again and go, haha, here's the rabbit, right? And I love rabbits. So, but since we're all kind of aspiring magicians here, it'd be grateful if you could explain the trick to us a little bit, which I'll make that a little clearer, I hope. So to say, elsewhere, recently you wrote, and this is a quote from Cary, "The ultra-philosophical takeaway is clear, and it is borne out by the history of science. You find complex life worlds and ontologies wherever you find them, and when you do, you have to acknowledge and investigate them in their own terms. In this light, philosophical humanism has had much to learn from the life sciences. But the philosophical point is that the life sciences and the current embrace of all things ecological, environmental, new materialist has much to learn as well from something it thinks is well in the rear view mirror, the animal, and so-called animal studies." So there were moments in your talk, however, where the animal seemed to become more kind of optico-historico effect, or even temporal illusion than anything else. The momentary sparks created by the meshing of different elements and forces and affordances. Merely one example of various autopoietic biological systems. Here I offer a new field called fleeting monad studies. But from a certain angle, jagged ontologies seem to dance nimbly around the ontological entity and foreground relations to the extent where the turtles disappear and it's rather milieu all the way down. So I guess I'm asking, where might we locate the creaturely as such, or phenomenology, alien or otherwise, Umwelten, and so on. So perhaps it's my literary training, but when I tangle with systems theory, I have the initial refreshing rush of reading like a nouveau roman, but I soon start to crave good old-fashioned characters and protagonists, scenes, stakes, interactions, and I suspect you do too.
Oh yeah.
So how do we account for phenomena on the molar and molecular level beyond description or mapping? What and where are the stakes here between the lines when it comes to identifying sources of strife for the material premise of the whole operation? I guess that's a way of saying the Anthropocene. How does one, to gesture to Haraway, locate the trouble and indeed the troublemakers in order to even stay with this trouble? So one way of thinking about this too is, if history is always already entering, is there any basis to make a distinction to be made between what was perhaps quaintly called natural history and what my colleagues study in the history program here, for instance? Getting to the end already soon. In my book, Human Error, I talk about the cybernetic triangle, which I use to draw attention to Norbert Wiener's indifference regarding any categorical or qualitative distinction between humans, animals, or machines. For him, and by extension, early cybernetics, it makes no difference if a signal moves through one or the other. The communication model holds either way, and informatics trumps metaphysics, taxonomy, ontology. So you rightly suggest that we should avoid the flattening of living versus physical systems and their radical different modes of causality and organization, I'm quoting, that occludes their specific roles in the larger dynamic of climate change. But I also wonder then, given the triangle and the machine on one corner, what about the joker of intelligence and the way that non-living learning machines might complicate this distinction. So I suppose I snuck at least 2-3 questions in there, but the main one, I suppose, to return full circle is if you'd care to say a bit more about why you feel a theoretical, conceptual, analytical fidelity to the figure of the animal, while recognizing that, qua Derrida, that it's a Gestalt fiction or convenience. Why should we still respect passing autopoetic ontologies among the tides of these molecular assemblages and whirlwinds of process philosophy? Why should the stone people and the plant people and the plastic people recognize the figural utility, presumably ethical, of the animal, or rather animals, including, of course, ourselves?
Well, thanks, Dom. It's hard to know where to begin, but let me try to tie together, I think, what sounded like two different parts of your comments, but are actually, to me, really intimately related. And that's the last one about machine intelligence, let's say, just in shorthand. And the earlier comment about when you were quoting from Before the Law about the necessity to return really to phenomenology and in some sense ontology in the quotation you read, which is, you find these life worlds where you find them. And the biopolitical danger, I mean, the example that I give in Before the Law is what I call the scandal of the cephalopods, that, we have always had this temptation to index phenomenological facts in life worlds to a certain kind of empirical or scientific taxonomy, a body plan. Oh, you have to be a chordate, you have to be a vertebrate, you have to live in social groups, you have to, have long lives, et cetera, to scaffold up to these phenomenological life worlds. And one of the values of the kind of ultra philosophical point, and this for me actually comes out of Derrida's engagement with Heidegger, because this is actually ultra Heideggerian point at this juncture, is to insist on keeping separate, in Heideggerian language, the ontic and the ontological. And so, and the point I try to make about that in Before the Law is that if you don't do that, there are serious biopolitical dangers that we're familiar with to thinking that we can index phenomenological and ontological life worlds to an empirical scientific taxonomy of any kind. And the history of science shows that we keep being surprised, actually, by how we can't do that. So that ultra philosophical point, which seems, in some sense, merely academic, you might say, actually turns out to be politically super important, biopolitically super important, to maintain that distinction between the ontic and the ontological. How that's related to your last point about, machine learning and so on, and of course the sci-fi people, as you know better than I've been all over this forever, is, and again, this is an important distinction to make, is that not just the biological, the material substrate of the form of recursive embodiment, if that's the term you want to use, does not matter, right? I mean, the example I use with my students, although most of them are too young to remember this, is the episode of Star Trek Next Generation where Commander Data goes in front of a court and argues for his right not to be disassembled, right? It's a great sort of, study of this question. That doesn't mean that the dynamic and recursive processes of embodiment through which life worlds emerge, isn't important. It is important. It just means that whether it's carbon-based or silicon-based is not the issue, right? So again, I think this returns us to a discussion of this returns us in a way to kind of the necessity of systems theory, to answer another one of your questions, because what you have to focus on, I think, are what are the recursive dynamics at work, not what is it made of, that enables those increasingly complex forms of emergence to happen, right?
So you can have life worlds without life.
Oh, totally.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
The reason that this talk took the shape that it did was actually to try to recontextualize the importance of what for me has always been a fundamentally kind of ecological, in a kind of radical sense of the term, of the quote unquote the animal, in ways that would intervene in, this kind of discourse of the Anthropocene that has just been ubiquitous over the past decade, and simply to say, look, even at the level of just talking about the fundamental dynamics of climate change and the kind of paradigm of Gaia, just to be moderately responsible about it, you've got to distinguish between the different roles that different elements in the Gaian system play of living systems versus physical systems. And of course, as you point out, when you get to that third distinction that I made at the end of the talk, the domain of the no and of the negative, right, and so on, then that just ratchets everything up exponentially, I would say, right? So the strategic gambit for me in this was to say, in the kind of economy of planned obsolescence that is the production of academic knowledge without which none of us would have jobs, we think that the animal is like, oh, that's such a, I don't know.
Posse.
Yeah, I was like, we've moved on to like stones and objects and all this stuff. It's like, well, maybe we have, but if you want to talk about climate change and Gaia, you better tend to the radically different qualitative modes of causality that obtain in living versus physical systems, just to talk about that, even if you're not interested in animals, right? And of course, a lot of the people who are involved in the discourse of the Anthropocene aren't interested in animals, right? Per se, right? So that's kind of a way to, I think, to tie together a few of the
no, that's really helpful.
A few of the observations that you were making, and that was also the rhetorical gambit for me, was to say, well, okay, let's reframe this thing we thought we had disposed of and left behind.
Yeah, right.
In critical theory and in sort of eco-philosophy more broadly. Let's reframe it in terms of the concerns that, quote unquote, we all agree are important and are on the front burner right now. And if you do that, you can't not return to the different orders of causation and organization in biological versus physical systems, right? So I share, Tim Morton's one of my best friends. In fact, he's coming over night after tomorrow to have dinner. I've had this conversation with Tim a bunch of times about, flat ontology,
Yeah.
And flat ontology, even though I have published books in the Posthumanity series that are about flat ontology, flat ontology, it seems to me, is precisely not what's needed to account for these differences, even though I radically share the desire and the commitment to saying, hey, human beings are just one thing among many things,
Right.
But that's where you start. That's not where you end. That's not the end of the conversation, right? So.
Yeah, it's like American exceptionalism. Like America is exceptional, but so is everywhere else.
Yeah, and that's what it's funny. Like I'm teaching a class right now called Adventures in Environmental Humanities, Art, Literature, Philosophy. And the first part of the course, I really front-loaded a lot of kind of Heideggerian material and Sloterdijk and Heidegger and Derrida and Heidegger and so on, precisely for this reason, that the kind of ultra-philosophical questions that I think you're drawing our attention to tend to get overlooked, I would say, in a lot of the conversations around the Anthropocene and flat ontologies and so on, and get overlooked in Latour's actor network theory, as far as I'm concerned. Even though Bruno's heart's in the right place, we're on the same team in many ways, but yeah.
Right. Well, thank you, Cary.
No, thanks, Dom, for those observations. Aaron, you want to open it up for conversation, or?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So to get on the queue, you can just raise your digital Zoom hand by going down to the reactions at the bottom of your screen and clicking raise hand, and I'll keep track of the queue as that's going on. There's a siren going by me right now. All right, Jay, I see you have your hand raised. We'll start with you.
Okay, so thank you for your paper. And I was really confident that I understood it until I heard your answer to Dom, which I really did not follow. So I understood the paper to be a critique of reductionism and a critique of Latour, and it's clear, and I'd love to hear you say more, but Latour really doesn't like Gaia. He's really opposed to the idea of Gaia. So it's a strange wedge that he uses for his own argument.
Yeah.
But his theory is not able to deal with downward causation of just the kind that you make essential to your argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I take it that theory of downward causation is incompatible with what I thought Dom was talking about. So maybe you can explain your conversation with Dom. I take downward causation to be the consequent of emergent properties, and emergent properties to be structural for life. My question, I'd love to hear what you think about how Latour misunderstands Gaia, but my precise question is really a worrying about levels, that at the very desire, so it goes back to Dom's question in a way, at the very desire to go up a level, to talk about different types of systems, in order to salvage something about living systems, it sounded to me as if you were flattening the ontology again. And one way, and I take it that was implied by Dom's question about the animal, but an easier way of asking it is, you seem uncomfortable with the Anthropocene, but yet the primary phenomena of the Anthropocene is species extinction.
Right.
And I think what I want to know is, in your account of the creative universe, which I agree with, that seems to flatten the notion of deep loss. And it seems to me that your account wasn't able to focus in on what I take to be the problem of the Anthropocene,
Yeah.
namely it as a structure. And I always tell my students, be wary when someone mentions the Anthropocene, but not the Holocene.
Right.
This is about the deconstruction of a certain type of Earth system with massive species loss as its consequence.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me exactly that got flattened to become invisible in your way of describing what you thought to be important about life.
Yeah, no, I mean, in a way, this goes back to what I was saying to Dom about the specific sort of intervention I was trying to make in the paper. You know, the stuff I've written about extinction, and in a way, this again is kind of an ultra Heideggerian point to make, I guess, is that, you know, there are two registers in which to engage extinction, and even to just say, what kind of event is extinction?
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, extinction, there's nothing more normal than, and actually uninteresting than extinction. 99.9% of the species that have ever existed are extinct.
Yep.
So that's one register in which to talk about extinction. But another register to talk about extinction, and I've written more about this really around specific artworks, about the extinction of the passenger pigeon, about the near extinction of the California condor, and so on, is to, and again, I think Derrida's relationship with Heidegger here is really important to me, at least, is to say, well, on the one hand, nothing's more normal than extinction. On the other hand, something absolutely unique and irreplaceable goes out of the world when a species becomes extinct. And there's no scientific or empirical language to describe that fact. That's a philosophical. I mean, you can register that fact, and but it's a different. I mean, in Heideggerian terms, it's a different kind of statement from a philosophical statement about what extinction is and why it matters. I think at the end of the day, with extinction, if you take both of those frameworks into account, I think where you end up still is actually with the problem, even if you return to the ontological and phenomenological questions, which to me open onto ethical questions that I've written a lot about. I think at the end of the day, you still have the problem of confronting ethnocentrism. So, you know, the way I put it to my students is like, look, it is not obvious that the extinction of polar bears is a bad thing. And if you think extinction of polar bears is a bad thing, you have to be prepared to make what turns out to be a pretty complex argument for why it's a bad thing. And the argument can't simply be because I care about polar bears, right? So it's at that point, to circle back actually to another aspect of Dom's comments, it's at that point that I think people like Gregory Bateson and that neighborhood of systems theory and cybernetics is actually really, really useful in bringing together what seem like two completely different sides of the question. So if you look at Steps to an Ecology of Mind by Bateson, for example, you know, and David Wood in some of his recent work is making a similar kind of argument in the recent book he did in the Posthumanity series. You know, you have to end up making the argument that polar bears are in some sense fundamentally us, and not because I care or don't care about polar bears, right? And that turns out to be a much more complicated argument to make. But I think a lot of what I hear in the discourse of the Anthropocene extinction is just kind of a taking for granted that climate change is bad, that extinction is bad. You know, and I tell us like, well, the jellyfish are loving climate change. You know, so you got to talk about for whom it matters and why it matters to you. So, and I do think to do that, you know, it requires a different kind of vocabulary, much more kind of philosophical and ethical vocabulary than I was using here. What I was trying to do in this talk was simply to say, look, if you take the Anthropocene seriously and you take Gaia seriously, whether you like it or not, you have to attend to the differences between physical dissipative structures and even complex physical dissipative structures and living organisms. And the role that they play in this larger geological biological feedback loop that actually constitutes what we call the planet, right? So in that sense, my talk was, you know, in a way, a much more limited, rhetorically, a much more limited engagement than Jay, the questions you're asking, I think. Which I do take up in more detail in that language in other places, but
I mean, but the reason, if I can just come back briefly, the reason for pressing them, right?
Yeah.
Is it's climate change that put Latour onto Gaia, right? So it seems to me one can't address what Latour's up to and try to address whether he's got an adequate framework or not until we can get the phenomena in view. And And as I say, it seems to me, and I agree with you, he remarkably manages to get it out of you almost immediately, right? Well, no, he doesn't seem to have read the first 5 pages of Gaia, right? Where the first 5 pages, Lovelock says, I thought science was reductionist, and I finally understood what I cared about was top-down causation, not bottom-up causation.
Right.
That's the project. There's no hint of that in the talk, right?
Right. Well, no, and this is where Bruce Clark's recent book, Gaian Systems, I think is a far superior engagement of this, partly because Bruce also has a deep and pretty scholarly engagement with not just Lynn Margulis's work, but the whole kind of archive of her work. And so I think Bruce's book, if I had to recommend one of the 2 books, there's no contest, I would say Bruce's book is the one to read, Gaian Systems.
Other questions? The floor is open. You can raise your hand to reactions, or you can just unmute yourself right now.
Dom, is there something else you want to circle back to, or, I mean, in light of Jay's comment or comments? You're going to have to unmute to do it, though.
I think it might be a bit late to be coherent on the heels of that and tie them together. But I mean, there is something, your talk did make me think about how, I don't know if you know Alex Galloway's kind of rant against what he calls the swervers. Or like this sort of reliance in affect theory, for instance, or in all sorts of fashionable discourse, how emergence is sort of just given as either an explanatory principle or as a kind of beacon of hope, of where there will be a swerve, a sort of Klineman, and things will change. It's sort of, I guess, the creative element in all of these systems, the unknowable. But so even if you're not, even if you are going bottom up, it doesn't have to be the kind of selfish gene model. There's something mystical, mystifying about the way humanities people deploy emergence, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let me recommend a shameless plug here that engages precisely this problem.
Yeah.
Recent special issue that I co-edited with Adam Nocek of Angelaki.
Oh yeah.
That's based on the work of a research group that I'm involved in, Stu Kaufman's involved in, called the Ontogenetic Process Group. And the project, or the issue, is called Ontogenesis Beyond Complexity, and it's precisely about this question and about trying to think ontogenesis and complexity beyond the models that we have from complexity theory and chaos theory and their inheritors, which turn out in some sense to be algorithmic for trying to take this question a little bit more seriously. But yeah, I agree that it's, you talked about a rabbit in the hat, and my rabbit in the hat's a real rabbit. I don't think that's a real rabbit.
Yeah. I just, I can't even, I tend to bring it back to even the singularity of an animal. Like my wife has been watching this Russian bear on live cam for nearly 2 years now. And like he's part of the family. And, I sort of learned as much from watching him as reading a lot of theory, because just the amount of creativity and sort of testing the environment and things like that that's going on with this one creature. It's almost like I tried to say in Creaturely Love, it's not a matter of the animal even on the level of species or things like that. Like the singularity of the organism is still something I'd like to keep. It's a baby I don't want to throw out with any bathwater, but then you can't just say that any individual, no matter how fleeting, is an event, because that's a kind of, you get into this Agamben redemption cycle where you need to salvage every single moment of perception or even just life worlding that's sort of automatized. So yeah, I mean, these are just the questions swirling from your talk, but they're not too coherent right now, but that's my rabbit, I guess, is sort of the individuated animal of whatever animal, and how it's sort of somehow generic and irrelevant from one perspective, and how precious it is, as Jay was suggesting, on the other, even if if this is, as any pet owner knows, right? Or companion species lover.
Yeah.
But I don't have any great sort of point to make other than those sort of different conflicting ways of parsing it all. They just don't seem compatible. So they're weird choices you make. As you said, interestingly, about the rhetoric of this one moment, it's like you have to choose your scale, your register, your audience, it's also situated even at that level.
Zed, you had a question?
Sure. Thanks for that talk, and thanks for that response. It's a really open-ended kind of question. It's really just an invitation to say more. It's about the human, non-human distinction. You started with some comments that kind of evinced, aversion or almost hostility towards that distinction. But then, you went on to qualify that kind of aversion. And I just want to invite you to say more about, it seems to me the question is just not like, do we have distinctions as such or not, but do we get the right distinctions? Or, there's a lot of distinctions out there, and we're really just concerned with getting, making them accurately. And so I just wonder, is there some in principled reason to think we shouldn't just be trying to get the human non-human distinction right, as opposed to trying to efface it?
Yeah, no, my attraction to, actually one of my early attractions to systems theory, going back to when I was reading Gregory Bateson as an undergraduate in a cultural anthropology class, was, I think it dawned on me that you actually get a much more robust description of, to use a Derridian locution, what calls itself human, if you don't allow the term human as humanist philosophy has used it to do any heavy lifting. So, so I'm like super interested. I mean, I touched on this in the talk, as you point out, about, that you don't immediately then say, oh, well, then we're all the same. That's what Derrida calls biologistic continuism. I think what you end up with is a much more, and finally, it's biopolitically much more differentiated and jagged ontological and phenomenological landscape, for which we really don't have, and traditional philosophy certainly doesn't have, a very useful vocabulary. In fact, all it has pretty much is blunt instruments, So one of the reasons in Before the Law that I was attracted to what I call the scandal of the cephalopods is precisely for this reason, that all these sort of higher order behaviors in life worlds that have been observed robustly in lots of different creatures have also been observed in cephalopods, cuttlefish, squid, octopus, and so on. But they don't have what we always thought was the required kind of body plan and neurophysiological plasticity that enables proportionate learning, that then you scaffold up into things like deception and play and so on to be able to engage in it. And so, for me, this is, I mean, it's philosophically interesting, it's phenomenologically interesting to observe that. But for me, what's really important about it is actually the biopolitical point, that we're clearly, the permanent mystery to me that I don't think anybody understands, and people have gone off in all kinds of crazy different directions to try to like describe this, including Nagel, by the way, is you have these complex life worlds that emerge through complex recursive dynamics from a physical material substrate, but are not reducible to any combinatory explanation of that physical substrate. I don't know anybody who has a satisfactory account of that fact. You know, so it kind of goes back to Dom's, kind of the end of Dom's question. I think, you know, where the ultra philosophical insistence for me then comes back in is to say, okay, you have to pay attention to that and to the ethical consequences of that wherever you find it. And in that project, to me, the vocabulary of human versus everything else is just useless. It's worse than a blunt instrument. And part of it is that also I'm really reluctant to generalize about the human or human beings. I mean, just on the basis of just kind of historical, anthropological, you know, unruliness and diversity of human populations over however many thousands of years. I'm more and more actually reluctant to make that generalization as well, which doesn't bother me because I don't really give a shit about an exhaustive description of the human. What I care more about is an exhaustive description of the things that seem to matter to us when we talk about this thing called human, right? And that's a different way of framing the question for me. That's much more productive, and that's part of what drew me to, you know, systems theory in the beginning, was the fact that it, in a weird way, it's a kind of a deontologized theoretical framework for doing that. Even though it's also can be a maddening, as you discovered in my talk, can be a maddening, can be a maddening vocabulary.
I remember when saying Luhmann is still waiting for his Masumi.
Yeah, good luck. No, I mean, Dom, I think I do think you're right. I mean, I was asking like, what was the animal? But I think part of your insight, you know, was you could just as well say, what will the animal be? In a way that's foreclosed by the current, you know, hegemonic, you know, disciplinary mores and the economy of kind of planned obsolescence and academic knowledge that we all live under. Yeah.
Yeah, extra weird temporalities.
Yeah.
The time.
I might jump in and ask a question that's sort of maybe similar to Zed's, or maybe I'm wondering, maybe you've read Matthew Calarco's recent short thing, Beyond the Anthropological Difference. It's a short little piece that he published, but I think his work is maybe more about what Zed seems to be concerned about, where he wants to end on this ontology of indistinction, and this is sort of the consequence that he wants to lead us to. And I was wondering about this. And this for him, I think, is both an ethical and a political decision to move towards indistinction between, as a way to attend to the violence that is often done with this divide between the human and the non-human animal.
Yeah, so but Aaron, that's exactly where the binary human animal is of no use. So if you want to attend to those kinds of indistinctions, then you immediately have to pay attention to the fact that, you and I have more in common with a bonobo or a chimpanzee or a dolphin or something than we do with a spider. That doesn't mean we can now go out and kill all the spiders. It simply means that to lump, and this was the point of Derrida's quotation early on, is to lump all of those creatures on this side of a divide called animal and have the human on the other side divide. It's just not a philosophically responsible way of dealing with the very question that Matt is interested in, right? So the multiplication of the jaggedness and the topography, which is a biopolitical topography of that landscape, to me just requires another kind of language, right? Mm-hmm. And it would be merely an academic exercise were it not for the fact, as Matt knows well, that serious ethical consequences follow hard on the heels of those descriptions, right? And that's where this is actually back to Zed's question. That's kind of what attracted me to saying, okay, let's figure out another way to talk about this. And one useful thing about work in the science, we think of ourselves as being this kind of vanguard, people who do animal studies or posthumanism, whatever. In fact, the sciences were way, 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 way out ahead of us for decades in terms of having a different kind of vocabulary to talk about, well, chimpanzees and human beings are not that different, and not just genetically either, right? In ways that it took the humanities and interpretive social sciences years and years and years to catch up with, right? So that's where again, I think the kind of work that I'm doing has actually benefited a lot, not from getting a PhD in English, but from work that people in the sciences were doing that, for which the term human wasn't really doing a lot of heavy lifting, actually.
I sometimes think the first human happened when the first bonobo pointed at his daughter and said, "You brought shame on this family."
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
not clear the bonobos have shame, but which is not a criticism, of course.
Right. But that first shamed bonobo is where we came from.
The breakthrough moment. Yeah.
Because I even, as unpopular as psychoanalysis is, I agree with people like Carla Freccero that there's something there about the superego and taboo and prohibition and law, as Derrida, I'm sure, would agree, it's from a certain angle.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Dom, and obviously you've written a lot about this, but everything I'm saying doesn't evacuate the fact, and it is a fact, that animals exist. But they exist not in a theoretically or philosophically rigorous way of the first vocabulary I'm using. They exist precisely in the way that you're referencing, right? That particular animals are hyper real, culturally, historically, anthropologically, in the cultures that are entwined with them. Right. So none of what I'm saying evacuates any of that at all. Right. And you've actually written more about that register of the problem than I have, actually.
Well, that's even when I think even something as like the totem, which Levi-Strauss was trying to leave behind. There's some way you could reanimate it a little bit if you look at it from that perspective, like as a hyper-real sort of figure.
Yeah. All I would say though is that once you've acknowledged that, and the reality of that fact, the other shoe to drop again is ethnocentrism. Right. Well, okay, ravens are important because me and my tribe care about ravens. And the philosophical point is that's not good enough. It doesn't mean it's not real, but the philosophical argument would be you have to return to the phenomenological and ontological domain precisely to meet that objection. And to say, no, bonobos are different from mosquitoes. And here's how and why, and here's why it matters. Right?
Yeah.
And once you've said that, it seems to me you've changed the conversation away from flat ontology, not just philosophically, but ethically.
Right. I'd love to hear Alice's thoughts on this, given she's written on ethics and animals so much.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, Alice. You could wait till tomorrow. But
She's like, it's 7:45 Eastern
I know,
time. Get me out of here.
But I do want to. I'm very curious to know what you're thinking as someone who's thought about this so much, so deeply.
I mean, there are aspects of the conversation I could pick up, but it depends on. It's really nice to meet you, by the way, Cary. I've never met you before, and I'm a keen reader of your work, and I mean, I think there are aspects of the conversation you've been having with my colleagues and students, our students just now, that are interesting. I suppose there's one thread in your exchange with Jay we could pick up, which I think had to do, maybe I could do it like this. If you could return to the moment in your response to him in which he's asking you whether the tragedy, whether your theoretical approach, at least in this paper, is allowing you to get the tragedy of the Anthropocene in view, and you have a kind of reservation about, I'm going to mention two things you said in response to him. One was about the idea that I think there's a lot of philosophy in this moment, that there is no scientific or empirical way of capturing what it is that we don't want to have go missing. So that's one thought. What happens there in our notions of the scientific and the empirical? And the other is the idea that if we try to use then other resources to capture what it is that we think is going missing. So take the case of you talking to your students about polar bears, or talking to an envisioned tribe about ravens, that we're in deep danger of ethnocentrism. So those are two categories, I suppose. One is the empirical and one is the ethnocentric. And I know these, at least the latter, I know to be a huge category for you. So it's not clear to me exactly how to ask you to locate your question, except that I know the category comes up differently for me, and I have a feeling it could be helpful to a lot of people here to hear you talk about why it's important for you and how it comes up, possibly in connection with the idea of the impotence of the empirical to do the work that we would want it to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and a great amplification of some of what Jay was talking about a moment ago. I guess part of the value for me is it forces us to return, the questions you're raising force us to return to a phenomenological and ontological register, without which the kinds of ethical questions that are between the lines everywhere and everything we're talking about can't be addressed. So, and how that's related to scientific knowledge and empirical knowledge is, it's not really a criticism of empirical or scientific knowledge. It's just, again, to kind of make the sort of ultra Heideggerian point, it's just a different kind of knowledge. And it's a valuable kind of knowledge, but it's not the kind of knowledge that will ever be able to answer a question like, why do life worlds matter? Not how do you describe one, not does an animal have one, but who cares, right? And so I think to the part of the question that Jay was asking about the singularity of particular, and Dom mentioned this as well, the singularity and the irreplaceable difference of particular creatures in the world has to do with that particularity, and that only, I think, a return to the phenomenological and the ontological mode of philosophical questioning can address, right? And I think that, to me, that's prior and necessarily prior to addressing the kind of ethical questions that that emerge from doing that. That's a different kind of conversation for me from saying, well, the reason the extinction of the polar bear is a bad thing is because me and my people like charismatic megafauna, right? A different answer to that question is to say, well, with human beings, we consider fundamental to moral standing the fact that you live in a life world in which it matters to you what happens to you. And you can situate yourself in relation to a life world, and fantasy is related to this, play in non-human animals is related to this, altruism, deception. There's a whole list of these kinds of characteristics that make up the kind of life world that we consider in human beings to be morally relevant to their treatment, right? Once you're having that kind of conversation, you're having a different kind of conversation, it seems to me, and a necessary one, than, well, polar bears going extinct are bad because we like polar bears, right? So, you know, and so for me, that then the question becomes, the kind of next turn of the screw for me, and again, I've learned a lot about this really from Derrida's complicated relationship with Heidegger, is to then kind of deconstruct the ontological privilege that human beings have, presumptively in Heidegger, in relation to these questions because of their possession of language under a certain understanding of what language is in relation to ontology and in relation to design. And Derrida's deconstruction of that, I think, is kind of the next turn of the screw for me that one has to follow. And it's a deflationary reading. I mean, it's a reading that says, well, human beings do not have the kind of relationship to death as such in its being because of their possession of language that Heidegger thinks they do, right? So as I put it in Before the Law, having a world in the mode of not having, which Heidegger says is true of animals but not humans, is actually probably the best description of design that we're likely to have. Because we don't have the kind of relationship to design that Heidegger thinks we can have, or to death for that matter. You know, and once you've said that, then you remain, to come back to Zed's question, you remain deeply interested in the question of the specificity of the human being, but without the humanist presumptions that undergird the division of human versus animal on the basis of world in somebody like Heidegger. So that's kind of a way to try to answer your question, but also try to come back to a couple of the other threads that came up earlier.
I wonder if I could push back for 1 second. I just
Yeah.
So I really am uncomfortable with this putting science on one side and philosophy on the other. It matters to me that Lovelock, of course, wrote Gaia, but then he wrote The Revenge of Gaia. And another book after that, kind of Goodbye to Gaia or something. That is, he began to see, and everyone who does Earth systems theory is committed to the thought that the idea that these accounts of change are ethically neutral is an error. That what they are doing is saying, no, the ethics is not something we bring phenomenologically in. No, the ethics is built into life forms in their mutual dependencies on one another, such that there are such things as harms to a biosystem. There are harms to an ecosystem. And once you accept that, then I'm puzzled why you think you need to go to Heidegger phenomenology to care about the phenomena. The phenomena is, as it were, constituted by invested structures of dangers and harms and thrivings and flourishings and failings and extinctions. Those are not neutral words.
Yeah,
Those
but Jay, the problem is you're right back to the debates over biocentrism and deep ecology that we had in the 80s, right? I mean, if you say life has a positive ethical valence, then immediately you have to raise questions like, well, okay, then we should just allow anthrax virus to wipe out kindergartens, or we should allow coronavirus to just do its thing. And if the fundamental principle is biodiversity, which it was for a lot of people doing deep ecology and biocentrism, then the first thing we should do is kill off like 70% of the human population, right? So I mean, the question you're raising is a familiar one, but it goes back to those conversations, I think, around deep ecology and biocentrism in the 80s, right?
It goes back to them because it resists the thought that we could make thoughts ourselves intelligible by pulling away from all those natural contexts, as if it was up to us. I mean, talk about anthropocentrism, up to us whether things have value or not. That can't, so while you're absolutely right? Just the fact that something's alive doesn't mean, the terrible problems of Paul Taylor's theory. Everything is intrinsically valuable. That won't get you very far ethically. But you're seeming to want to go back to everything that the discovery of autopoietic systems, right, was attempting to show was an illegitimate flattening, right, of the structures of difference that are already there. So that's what I meant by my worry earlier, that you seem to flatten rather than have a jagged ontology, because you seem to not want those differences to register already.
Oh, no. I want them to register. I want them to register all over the place. It's just the vocabulary of human versus animal is not going to do you any good. I mean, what I'm reminded by actually in your comment, is the debates that took place, because I got into all this stuff actually because I was an animal rights activist when I was a graduate student. And what I'm actually reminded of is the debates between animal rights activists and environmental ethics people going back to the 70s and 80s about, what is the kind of constitutive element of the ethical problematic or the ethical relation? And for animal rights people, it was actually the individual animal. I mean, white-tailed deer is like exhibit A with this. And for the kind of position that you're voicing, it was really something more like the ecosystem or biodiversity or something like that, right? For which the interest of particular animals, let's say again, white-tailed deer, could be sacrificed, right? So that's what your comment reminds me of, is those kind of formative and irreconcilable debates between the animal rights people and environmental ethics people, of which the deep ecology and biocentrism conversation was part. I think the place where these two meet, and I'm thinking again of David Wood's recent book in the Posthumanities series, is an end run argument which says, look, well, part of the reason has to do not whether you care about something or not, or whether it matters to you or not, but the fundamental move that I try to make in what is posthumanism is to say all this comes back to actually deconstructing the concept of the human as being something that coincides with itself, or that is wholly self-possessed and so on. I mean, this is just biologically true, that all the stuff in the microbiome now would be like exhibit A, and immunology would be exhibit A. Human beings are fundamentally ecologically constituted. What we call human is something else. And it's kind of a fantasy that we have of ourselves, right, in philosophy, that I think Derrida, you know, in my paper sort of was the person who was voicing that. And this actually comes back to a question Dom is very interested in, I think, in his work, which is to say, well, once you've said that, then the question of what kind of access do you have or not have, the way I put it in the paper, in that sort of critique of the term agency and intentionality, is that whatever picture we give to ourselves of that ecological embeddedness is by definition going to be blind and partial and uninformed in ways, not because we're not looking hard enough or we're not smart enough, they're constitutively impossible to know for agency and intentionality. What are the implications of that fact then for the question that you're asking? I think that's a really, really super interesting question. And that's how David Wood attempts to kind of come at the kind of why should we care about polar bears question in his book, because the shorthand answer is, well, in some fundamental sense, because polar bears are us. And, you know, in that sort of ecological sense that I'm voicing, in ways that we don't have transparent, intentional access to. And this is where Dom, I think, you know, mentioned the lessons of psychoanalysis. This would be one of the places that a little psychoanalysis goes a long way. But what we're really talking about now is more of an kind of an ecological embeddedness that, I mean, I don't know what's going on with the microbiome in my gut right now, and I can't know, you know, in the sense that we're discussing. So that's one way I think of bringing the two ends of the question together. Dom, I didn't mean to put words in your mouth there, but you are, I know you are interested in this.
Yeah. But yeah, I've run out of words, so you can put them there.
Yeah.
They can add to my microbiome.
We are just a little after 8. If there's any last quick final questions, maybe we can take that. Otherwise, I want to be respectful of everybody's time here this evening.
Well, Aaron, I want to thank you again for, thanks again for the invitation and for sticking with this. I appreciate you putting it together.
No, thank you. Thank you, Cary and Dom, for the presentations, and everyone, yeah, for being patient with the rescheduling and transferring to the digital realm. I think this has been a great first day of the conference, and hope to see a lot of you here tomorrow. And thank you again, Cary and Dom, for the fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thanks all.
My pleasure.
And thanks, Cary.